A lone waitress's quick observation about a detail everyone else missed saved the life of a billionaire, unaware that her selfless act would change her own shattered world forever. "You are fired. Get out of my sight immediately." The rain hammered down on the thin roof of the dilapidated apartment building, a relentless drumming that echoed the frantic pounding in Alara's own chest. Each drop that slid down the grimy windowpane seemed to carry with it a sliver of her dwindling hope, tracing a path of despair across the glass before vanishing into the night. She sat at her worn, wobbly kitchen table, the wood scarred with the history of 1,000 desperate meals, and stared at the small pile of coins she had just emptied from a dusty jar. The flickering light from a single, bare bulb overhead cast long, dancing shadows across the room, making the peeling paint and water-stained ceiling seem even more menacing. It was not enough. The coins shimmered with a pathetic glint, a collection of coppers and silvers that amounted to less than half of what she needed for her son's medicine. A dry, racking cough echoed from the other room, a sound that splintered Alara's already fragile composure. It was Leo's cough, a hollow, persistent sound that had become the cruel soundtrack to their lives for the past month. She clenched her trembling hands into fists, her knuckles white against the dark wood of the table. The biting cold of the room seeped into her bones, a damp chill that no threadbare blanket could ever hope to ward off. She was so tired. A profound, soul-deep weariness settled over her, heavier than any physical exhaustion she had ever known. She thought back to the job she'd lost 3 months prior, a decent position as a receptionist at a law firm where the pay was steady and the hours were reasonable. She had been unjustly fired, a casualty of office politics and a manager's baseless accusation. But there had been no one to defend her, no one to speak to her unwavering work ethic or her gentle character. So she had fallen, tumbling from a precarious state of stability into this freefall of quiet desperation. Now, there was only the diner, a greasy spoon establishment with sticky floors and a perpetually angry owner, where the tips were meager and the humiliation was plentiful. She pushed herself up from the table, her movements slow and stiff. Her reflection in the dark window was a pale, haunted specter. Gaunt cheeks, hollow eyes ringed with exhaustion, and a mouth set in a line of quiet resolve. She was a ghost in her own life. With a sigh that seemed to draw up the last of her strength, she went to her small closet and pulled out her uniform. The fabric was worn thin, the pale pink faded to a sad, washed-out gray, and a faint but permanent scent of stale coffee and grease clung to it. As she buttoned the crisp, albeit threadbare, shirt, she could hear Leo stirring, his small whimper a fresh stab of pain in her heart. She walked softly into his room, a tiny space barely large enough for his bed and a small chest of drawers. He was so small, so fragile beneath the thin blanket, his face pale in the dim light filtering in from the hallway. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by that terrible, rattling cough. She knelt by his bed, her hand gently brushing a damp curl of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm, too warm. The fever was climbing again. "I'll be back soon, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll get your medicine." I promise. He didn't stir, lost in a fitful sleep. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away with a fierce, swift motion. Crying wouldn't pay the bills. Crying wouldn't buy the prescription. Only work would. Only enduring. She pulled on her thin coat, a garment that offered little protection against the relentless storm outside, and grabbed her keys. The soft click of the lock behind her echoed in the empty, silent hallway. Total silence. The diner was an assault on the senses, a cacophony of clattering plates, sizzling oil, and the loud, boisterous laughter of the evening patrons. The air was thick with the smell of fried onions and burnt coffee, a scent that clung to Alara's hair and closed the moment she stepped inside. Her boss, a stout man named Sal with a perpetually florid face and a booming voice, barked an order at her before she had even finished tying her apron. The work was grueling, a relentless cycle of taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and clearing away half-eaten plates, all while maintaining a polite, if weary, smile. Her feet ached, a dull throb that radiated up her legs, but she pushed the pain aside, focusing only on the potential tips, on the coins that could mean the difference between Leo getting his medicine tonight or suffering through another night of fever. She moved through the crowded tables with a practiced grace, her expression a mask of serene efficiency. No one looking at her would have guessed at the desperate storm raging inside her, the fear that coiled like a cold snake in the pit of her stomach. They saw only a waitress, another anonymous face in the service of their fleeting needs. Hours bled into one another. The rain continued its assault on the diner's large plate glass windows, the world outside a blurry mess of streetlights and rushing water. It was in the midst of this controlled chaos that she first saw him. He was sitting alone in a booth in the far corner, a space usually avoided by customers because of the draft from a poorly sealed window. He hadn't been there when her shift started. He must have slipped in quietly, seeking refuge from the storm. He looked ordinary. His clothes were simple, a dark, well-worn coat and a plain gray sweater. Yet, there was an aura of profound stillness about him that seemed to absorb the noise of the diner, creating a small pocket of silence around him. His face was etched with a deep, unspoken sorrow, and his eyes, when he briefly looked up from the menu, were haunted. They were the eyes of a man who had looked into an abyss and had never truly looked away. Alara felt a strange, immediate kinship with that look, a recognition of a shared, unbearable weight. He didn't seem to be reading the menu so much as staring through it, his thoughts a million miles away. He ordered only a black coffee, his voice low and raspy, as if it hadn't been used in some time. As she placed the heavy ceramic mug on the table, their fingers brushed for a fleeting second. A jolt, like a static shock, passed between them. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. She saw in his eyes not just sadness, but a shattering loneliness that mirrored her own. It was a momentary connection, a silent acknowledgement of mutual pain in a world that rushed past, oblivious. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then his gaze dropped back to the dark, swirling liquid in his cup. Alara turned away, her heart thudding strangely in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but that brief, silent exchange was the first tremor of a seismic shift that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. She was just a waitress. He was just a customer. The transaction was simple. She continued her rounds, the image of the man's haunted eyes seared into her mind. Sal yelled at her for being too slow with an order of pancakes, his voice grating on her already frayed nerves. She simply nodded, murmuring a quiet apology, and hurried to the kitchen. Her thoughts, however, kept drifting back to the man in the corner booth. There was something about his pallor, a grayish tint to his skin that was more than just fatigue. It was a detail most would overlook, lost in the sallow, flickering light of the diner. But Alara had seen that specific shade of pale before. It was the color of her father's face in the weeks leading up to his first heart attack, a subtle warning sign they had all tragically missed. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was none of her business. She was a waitress, not a doctor. Her job was to serve coffee, not to diagnose the quiet sorrows of strangers. She picked up a fresh pot of coffee, the glass hot against her palm, and began making her way through her section, offering refills with a practiced, gentle smile. When she reached the corner booth again, the man was staring out the window at the pounding rain, his coffee untouched. He seemed to be holding himself unnaturally still, his shoulders rigid. As she approached, he reached for the mug. It was then that she saw it, a slight, almost invisible tremor in his hand. His fingers, wrapped around the ceramic, were unsteady. At the same time, she noticed the faintest bluish tinge to his lips, a detail made stark by the unnatural pallor of his skin. He raised the mug, his movements slow, deliberate. He was about to take a sip. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over Alara. The memory of her father flashed through her mind with searing clarity. The same pallor, the same subtle tremor, the same quiet complaint of a tightness in his chest that he had dismissed as indigestion. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to do something. Hesitation warred with a powerful, inexplicable urge to intervene. Sal's angry face swam in her vision. Don't bother the customers. Keep moving. Mind your own business. The words were a mantra of survival in this place. Bothering a customer, especially one who hadn't asked for anything, was a cardinal sin. It could cost her the few precious dollars in tips she hoped to earn. Could cost her this miserable, essential job. Her gaze fell on his hand again, then to the way his other hand was resting on the table, subtly, almost unconsciously pressed against his chest. The internal debate lasted only a second. The potential cost to her was nothing compared to the potential cost to him. Leo's feverish face flashed in her mind. What was the right thing to do? To protect her job or to protect a life? For Alara, there was no real choice. Her own hardship had not extinguished her empathy. It had refined it. She moved without another thought. She reached the table in 2 quick strides, her own hand surprisingly steady as she placed it gently over his. "Don't," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. He froze, the mug halfway to his lips. He looked up at her, his haunted eyes wide with surprise and confusion. "Please," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Don't drink that. Just wait a moment. Please." She was already pulling the phone from her apron pocket. Her fingers flew across the screen, dialing the emergency number with a speed born of pure adrenaline. She had made her choice. The man stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to a flicker of annoyance, then back to a dawning, weary understanding. He didn't protest further. He simply lowered the mug back to the table, his hand trembling more noticeably now. A soft gasp escaped his lips, and he leaned back against the worn vinyl of the booth, his eyes closing for a moment. The entire diner seemed to have frozen, all eyes turning to their corner. Sal was already storming towards them, his face a thunderous shade of crimson. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he boomed, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent room. "Harassing my customers. Calling? Who are you calling?" Alara ignored him. She spoke calmly and clearly into the phone, giving the dispatcher the address and describing the man's symptoms with a precision that surprised even herself. The pallor, the tremor, the subtle cyanosis, the chest pressure she was only guessing at but felt certain of. "Get out!" Sal roared, grabbing her arm. "You're fired. Get out of my sight immediately." His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her skin. But Alara stood her ground, finishing the call before pulling her arm free. She looked not at Sal, but at the man in the booth. His eyes were open again, fixed on her. In their depths, she saw not anger, but a profound, raw gratitude. The wail of a siren grew rapidly louder, cutting through the sound of the rain. The paramedics burst through the door moments later, their movements efficient and professional. They were at the booth in an instant, their calm voices a stark contrast to Sal's continued shouting. They hooked the man up to a heart monitor, the machine immediately letting out a series of sharp, urgent beeps. "BP is dropping fast," one of them said. "Looks like a massive cardiac event. You're lucky someone called when they did." The lead paramedic looked at Alara, his expression serious. "You probably just saved his life. That much caffeine could have been fatal." The words hung in the air. Sal fell silent, his face paling. The other customers murmured amongst themselves, their gazes shifting from the unfolding medical drama to Alara, a new respect dawning in their eyes. But it was too late. The damage was done. Alara felt a hollow ache spread through her chest. She had done the right thing, the only thing she could have done, but it had cost her everything. As the paramedics prepared to wheel the man out on a stretcher, he reached out a weak hand, his eyes searching for hers. "Thank you," he mouthed, the words barely audible. His gaze was intense, unwavering, and in it, Alara saw a silent promise. Then he was gone, swept out into the stormy night, leaving behind a wake of silence and the lingering scent of antiseptic. The spell was broken. Sal, his face now a mottled mix of anger and embarrassment, pointed a trembling finger at the door. "I meant what I said," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You're finished here. Leave your apron and go." Without a word, Alara untied the strings of the faded gray apron. She folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. She didn't look at Sal. She didn't look at the other customers who were now staring at her with a mixture of pity and admiration. She held her head high, her dignity a fragile shield against the crushing weight of humiliation and despair. She walked out of the diner and back into the pounding rain, without her job, without her final pay, without a single coin more than when she had arrived. The cold soaked through her thin coat instantly, but she barely felt it. All she could feel was the icy grip of fear for her son, for their future. She was alone. The walk home was a blur of rain-slicked streets and the distorted glare of headlights on wet asphalt. Each step was heavy, laden with the unbearable weight of her failure. When she finally reached her apartment, the silence that greeted her was more deafening than the storm outside. Leo was still asleep, his breathing still shallow and ragged. She checked his temperature. The fever had climbed higher. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, painful sound. She had failed him. She sank onto the floor, her back against the cold wall of the hallway, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. The tears came in a hot, silent torrent, tears of frustration, of fear, of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wound. The next few days were the darkest Alara had ever known. She spent her hours searching for any work she could find. Washing dishes, cleaning houses, anything. But the city was unforgiving. Her small savings dwindled to nothing. The final blow came in the form of a stark white envelope slipped under her door. An eviction notice. The crisp paper felt like a death sentence in her hands. She had 72 hours. Despair was a physical presence in the small apartment, a heavy fog that made it difficult to breathe. She sat with Leo, holding his small, warm hand, singing him quiet lullabies as she tried to fight back the rising tide of panic. She had no one to turn to, no family to call for help. They were utterly, completely alone. On the morning the eviction notice was set to expire, she was woken by a soft thud at her door. Her heart clenched, certain it was the landlord coming to throw them out onto the street. With trembling hands, she opened the door. There was no one there, but on the worn doormat lay a plain brown envelope. It was thick. Her name, Alara, was written on it in neat, simple block letters. With a sense of dread, she picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a thick stack of cash. She counted it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely separate the bills. It was exactly the amount she needed for 2 months' rent, plus the full cost of Leo's prescription with some left over. Tucked inside the stack of money was a small, folded note. There were only 4 words on it, written in the same neat hand. For your kindness. Alara stared at the money, then at the note, her mind reeling. It didn't make any sense. Who? How? She thought of the man from the diner, the silent promise in his eyes, but it seemed impossible. He was a stranger, just an ordinary man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The thought vanished as quickly as it came. It was too fantastic, too much like a fairy tale. And Alara had stopped believing in fairy tales a long time ago. But the miracles did not stop there. The next day, a delivery truck pulled up outside her building. 2 men carried box after box of groceries up to her apartment. Fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, milk, everything she hadn't been able to afford for months. The delivery slip said it was all paid for, an anonymous gift. 2 days later, her phone rang. It was the office of a renowned pediatric pulmonologist, one of the best in the city. The receptionist informed her that an appointment had been made for Leo, and that all costs for his consultation and any subsequent treatment had been covered in full by an anonymous benefactor. Alara sank into a chair, the phone pressed to her ear, speechless. Tears of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude streamed down her face. It was too much, felt like a dream. Unbeknownst to her, miles away, in a stately, cavernous office overlooking the glittering city skyline, Alistair Vance sat behind a polished marble desk. He was no longer the gaunt, weary man from the diner. Rest and proper medical care had restored some of his color, but the deep sadness in his eyes remained. He listened as his assistant confirmed the final arrangements for the boy's medical care. "Everything is in place, Mr. Vance," the assistant said. The specialist will see him tomorrow. Alistair nodded, his gaze distant. And the mother? Alara? Is she secure? Yes, sir. The rent is paid for the next 6 months, and her accounts have been credited. She won't have to worry about finances. Good, Alistair said, his voice quiet but firm. Ensure she is never aware of the source. Not yet. The assistant left, and Alistair swiveled his chair to face the vast window. He had spent the days since his discharge from the hospital consumed by a single, renewed purpose: to find the quiet, dignified waitress who had saved his life. His investigators had been efficient. They had uncovered the story of her hardship, her unjust firing, her sick son, her profound integrity in the face of it all. Each detail was like a balm on his own wounded soul. In a world that had become transactional and cynical, a world that had taken everything from him, her selfless kindness was a beacon of pure, unwavering light. It had reawakened something in him, a part of his heart he thought had died with his wife and daughter. He had the power to erase her suffering, to give her the security she so richly deserved. And he would. But he would do it carefully. He needed to see her again, not as a billionaire benefactor, but as the man whose life she had saved. He needed to understand the source of her strength. He needed to thank her. He needed to know her. The biting cold of late autumn had settled over the city, stripping the trees of their leaves and leaving behind a stark, brittle landscape. Thanks to the anonymous gifts, Alara's life had stabilized into a new, bewildering reality. Leo, under the care of the specialist, was finally getting better. His cough was subsiding, the color returning to his cheeks. The constant, gnawing fear for his health had been replaced by a quiet, hopeful relief. The refrigerator was full, the rent was paid, but the mystery of her benefactor remained, a persistent question mark hanging over her newfound security. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but also a strange unease, as if she were living a life that wasn't truly her own. One crisp afternoon, she took Leo to a small park near their apartment. He was bundled up in a new, warm coat, another anonymous gift, and his laughter as he chased a scattering of pigeons was the most beautiful sound Alara had ever heard. She sat on a cold park bench, a small, sincere smile on her face, watching him. "Is this seat taken?" a quiet voice asked. Alara looked up. It was him, the man from the diner. He looked different, healthier. The gaunt, haunted look was still there in the depths of his eyes, but it was softer now, tempered by something else. He was dressed simply again, in jeans and a dark wool coat, looking for all the world like any other person seeking a moment of peace in the park. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp thud. "No," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, they sat in a comfortable silence, watching her son play. "He looks happy," the man said finally. "He is," Alara replied softly. "He's getting better." "I'm glad to hear that." Another silence fell, this one filled with unspoken words. "I never had the chance to thank you properly," he said, turning to look at her. His gaze was direct, and filled with a raw sincerity that made her breath catch. "My name is Alistair Alara," she responded. "I know," he said with a small smile. "Alara, you saved my life. The doctors were very clear about that. If you hadn't intervened." He trailed off, his jaw clenching. "I'm just glad you're okay," she said, her voice steady. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said, shaking his head. "They wouldn't have. Everyone else saw a customer. You saw a person. You risked everything for a stranger he knew." He must have seen Sal fire her. A flush of old humiliation rose in her cheeks, but he seemed to sense it. "What that man did was unforgivable," he said, his voice laced with a quiet anger. "I am so sorry that your compassion was punished." The conversation flowed easily after that. He didn't ask probing questions, but listened with an intensity that made Alara feel truly seen. She found herself telling him about Leo, about her struggles before the miracles began, about her hopes for a simple, quiet life. She spoke of her reality not with self-pity, but with the same dignified resolve she carried herself with every day. Alistair listened, his expression unwavering, his steady presence a balm to her weary soul. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just listened. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, he asked, "May I ask you a personal question?" She nodded. "Why did you do it? That night in the diner. What made you risk so much?" Alara thought for a moment, her gaze drifting back to Leo, who was now trying to coax a squirrel down from a tree. "My father," she said, her voice soft. "He passed away from a heart attack a few years ago. The signs were all there, but we missed them. We didn't know what to look for." She turned back to Alistair, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "When I looked at you, I saw him, and I couldn't bear the thought of missing the signs again." A profound silence enveloped them. Alistair's carefully constructed composure seemed to crack, a look of immense, shared grief flashing in his eyes. He simply nodded, a world of understanding passing between them in that small gesture. He felt an undeniable connection to this woman, a bond forged in a moment of crisis and now deepening in the quiet honesty of a park bench confession. They began to meet regularly at the park. Alistair would appear just as she and Leo were arriving, sometimes with 2 cups of hot tea from a nearby cafe, the steam rising like white flags in the crisp air. Their conversations became the anchor of Alara's week, a quiet space of warmth and understanding in a world that had often been cold and hostile. She found herself looking forward to his steady presence, to the way he listened, to the shared, unspoken sorrow in his eyes that made her own feel less heavy. He never spoke of his own life, and she never asked. It was enough that he was there, a kind and gentle friend who had appeared in her life as mysteriously as the anonymous gifts. One evening, as a heavy fog rolled in, blanketing the park in a soft hush, they sat on their usual bench while Leo slept soundly in his stroller beside them. The world felt muted, distant. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the fog, or the gentle warmth of the tea he had brought, but Alistair finally began to speak. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. This quiet, this emptiness. Alara waited, her hands wrapped around her warm cup, her full attention on him. "I had a family," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "A wife, Amelia, and a daughter, Lily. She was 6. She had her mother's laugh." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "They were my entire world, my reason for everything. 3 years ago there was an accident. A drunk driver on a rainy night. I was in a different city on business. I got a phone call." His words faltered, the raw pain of the memory stealing his voice. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The sterile silence that followed was filled with the magnitude of his loss. Alara's heart ached for him, a deep, empathetic pain that transcended words. She saw now the source of the profound sadness in his eyes. It was not just sorrow. It was a shattered world, a life splintered into a before and an after. "I lost them both," he whispered, the words barely audible over the distant city hum. "And in a way, I lost myself. My life became hollow, just a series of rooms to walk through, meetings to attend. There was no color, no sound. Just a long, sterile silence." He fell quiet, his shoulders slumping as if under an immense, invisible weight. Alara looked at him, at this man who had shown her such gentle kindness, and saw the deep, unbearable wound he carried every single day. She knew that empty platitudes like, "I'm sorry for your loss," would be meaningless, an insult to the scale of his grief. Instead, she did the only thing that felt true. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. It was a simple, grounding touch, a gesture of shared humanity in the isolating fog. It was not romantic, not pitying, but an act of sincere, unspoken empathy. "You are not alone in your quiet," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time, he let his guard down completely, and she saw the full depth of his pain. He didn't pull away. He simply let her hand rest there, a small point of warmth in the biting cold. "That night in the diner," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I had gone there. I don't know why. I was just wandering. I was thinking about how pointless it all was. And then your kindness, it was the first thing that had felt real in years. It was like a light being switched on in a dark, forgotten room. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and he didn't wipe it away. In that moment, on a fog-shrouded park bench, two profoundly broken people found a fragile, sacred solace in one another's presence. A bond was forged, not just of friendship, but of two shattered souls beginning to piece each other back together. They were no longer just strangers. Weeks turned into a month, and the fragile bond between Alara and Alistair deepened into a quiet, steady friendship. He became a fixture in their lives, a gentle presence who would help Leo fly a kite or simply sit with Alara in comfortable silence. He never overstepped, never offered anything more than his time and his unwavering attention. And for Alara, that was more valuable than any amount of money. She still had no idea who he truly was, no inkling of the immense wealth and power he wielded. To her, he was just Alistair, a kind man with a broken heart, a fellow traveler on the difficult road of grief and survival. One afternoon, Alara was walking home from a job interview, a hopeful prospect at a local library, when her path took her past the diner. She usually avoided that block, the memory of her public humiliation still a fresh, stinging wound. But today, caught in her thoughts, she found herself standing across the street from it. It looked the same. The greasy windows, the flickering neon sign. As she watched, the door swung open and her former boss, Sal, stepped out, arguing loudly with a woman Alara recognized with a jolt of cold dread. It was Brenda, her ex-husband's mother, a cruel, elitist woman who had always looked down on Alara and had made the final years of her marriage unbearable. Seeing them together sent a shiver down her spine. Brenda's sharp, hawk-like eyes scanned the street and landed on Alara. A malicious, triumphant smile spread across her face. She said something to Sal and then marched directly across the street towards Alara, her heels clicking ominously on the pavement. Well, Brenda sneered, her voice dripping with venom. If it isn't the little charity case. I heard you got fired from this dump. Can't say I'm surprised. You've never been able to hold on to anything good, have you? Alara froze, her blood turning to ice. She wanted to turn and walk away, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Leave me alone, Brenda, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Oh, I'm just getting started, Brenda continued, her voice rising in volume, attracting the attention of passers-by. A small crowd began to form. Sal here was just telling me how you made a hysterical scene and got yourself thrown out on your ear. It's the story of your life, isn't it? Always the victim. A pathetic, single mother who can't even afford to take care of her own child. Each word was a calculated, poisoned dart. Alara stood, pale and silent, her dignity her only defense. She could feel the stares of the crowd, their pity and morbid curiosity. She wrapped her arms around herself, a desperate, protective gesture. Sal crossed the street to join Brenda, a smug look on his face. She's trouble, this one, he said to the crowd. Thinks she's better than everyone. Caused a scene that nearly gave a customer a heart attack. The lie was so blatant, so cruel, that Alara gasped. She was trapped, cornered, subjected to a public crucifixion built on lies and malice. Just as the humiliation became unbearable, just as a tear of helpless rage began to form in her eye, a sleek, gleaming black car pulled up to the curb with a whisper-quiet hum. The crowd parted instinctively. The back door opened, and Alistair stepped out. But it was not the Alistair she knew. Gone were the simple jeans and worn coat. He was dressed in an impeccable, crisp, dark gray suit that fit him perfectly. His posture was commanding, his expression calm but radiating an aura of absolute, undeniable power. He was a different man. He was a king. Alistair's eyes, cold and sharp as polished steel, swept over the scene, taking in Brenda's sneering face, Sal's pathetic swagger, and the small, trembling figure of Alara. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second as it rested on her, a silent message of reassurance passing between them. Then he moved. He walked calmly, deliberately to Alara's side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch was a grounding force in the swirling vortex of her shock and humiliation. He didn't even glance at Sal. He fixed his commanding gaze on Brenda, who faltered, her venomous tirade dying in her throat. "I believe you were just speaking about this woman," Alistair said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight that cut through the street noise. The crowd fell silent, captivated. "You seem to be under several grave misapprehensions. Allow me to correct them," he paused, letting the tension build. "First," he continued, his tone dangerously smooth, "this woman Alara is not a charity case. She is the most honorable, compassionate, and resilient person I have ever had the privilege of knowing. Second, she did not cause a scene in that establishment." He finally turned his head to look at Sal, a look of such utter contempt in his eyes that the diner owner physically recoiled. "She saved a man's life. My life." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sal's face went from smug to ashen white in an instant. Brenda stared, her mouth agape. "My name is Alistair Vance," he stated simply, and the name echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence. Even Alara, who did not follow the world of finance, recognized it. Vance Industries was one of the largest conglomerates in the world. The name was synonymous with staggering wealth and power. It was on buildings, on news reports, on the very fabric of the city. Her mind struggled to connect this commanding figure with the quiet, grieving man who drank tea with her on a park bench. They were the same person. It was unbelievable. "I own this entire block," Alistair said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper as he addressed Sal directly, "including the building your sad little diner currently occupies. Your lease is terminated, effective immediately. My lawyers will be in contact with you in the morning. I suggest you have your things packed." Sal sputtered, speechless, his face a mask of pure terror. Alistair dismissed him with a final, withering glance and turned his full attention back to Alara, his expression softening completely. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch tender. "And as for you being a pathetic mother," he said, his voice now loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, "you are the most dedicated and selfless mother I have ever seen. You have raised an incredible son in the face of unimaginable hardship, and you have done it with a grace and dignity that is nothing short of heroic." He reached into his immaculate suit jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen. In front of everyone, he wrote out a check and handed it to a stunned Brenda. "This is for your silence," he said coolly. "From this moment forward, you will never speak to or about Alara again. If I hear that you have, I will use the full extent of my resources to dismantle every aspect of your life. Am I clear?" Brenda, trembling, could only nod, snatching the check before scurrying away like a frightened rat. Alistair then turned to Alara, his eyes filled with a profound, raw emotion. "Alara," he said, his voice now gentle, intimate, meant only for her. "I know this is a shock. I wanted to tell you. I needed you to know me first, the man, not the money. The money is just a tool. Can fix problems, like this 1 inch," he gestured vaguely at the diner. "But it can't heal a heart. Only people can do that. And you healed mine." He took both of her hands in his. "I am falling in love with you, Alara. I have been since the moment you showed me that kindness still exists in this world." In the middle of a city street, surrounded by stunned strangers, Alistair Vance, the billionaire, laid his heart bare to the waitress who had saved him. He offered her not just security, not just wealth, but a chance at a new life, a life filled with the love and safety she so richly deserved. Alara looked into his eyes, the same haunted eyes she had first seen in the diner, now filled with love for her, and for the first time in a very long time, she saw a future. A real future. She finally smiled. 1 year later, the golden glow of late afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a beautiful, stately home, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The sound of a child's unrestrained laughter echoed from the lush green lawn outside, a pure, joyous sound that filled the house with life. Alara stood by the window, a cup of tea warming her hands, and watched. Alistair was on the grass, rolling around with Leo, who was now a healthy, vibrant 7-year-old. His face alight with pure happiness. They were building a fortress out of pillows and blankets, a grand, chaotic affair. Alistair, the powerful CEO who commanded boardrooms and moved markets, was on his hands and knees, pretending to be a dragon, his roars more comical than fearsome. Leo shrieked with delight, pelting him with soft pillows. The sterile silence that had once defined Alistair's life had been replaced by this beautiful, wonderful noise. The hollow ache in Alara's heart, a companion for so many years, was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace and a love so deep it felt like it was woven into the very fabric of her being. After that day on the street, everything had changed with breathtaking speed. Alistair had been true to his word. He had not just given her security, he had given her a partnership. He had established a charitable foundation in her name, dedicated to helping single parents and families in medical crisis, and he had insisted she run it, trusting her innate compassion and wisdom. She had found her purpose, not as a recipient of charity, but as a source of it. The diner was gone, replaced by a community center that offered free meals and childcare. Her life was unrecognizable from the desperate, coin-counting existence she had once known, but at her core, she was the same. Her kindness, her dignity, her quiet strength. These were the things Alistair had fallen in love with, and they were the pillars upon which they built their new life. He walked into the living room, scooping a laughing Leo into his arms. He came over to where Alara was standing and wrapped his free arm around her waist, pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was just thinking," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "About that night, in the diner, how a cup of coffee could change everything." "You changed everything, Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You walked into the darkness and switched on the light." He looked down at Leo, then back at her, his eyes filled with a love and gratitude that still took her breath away. "You gave me my life back. Both of you." They stood there for a long moment, a family forged not by blood, but by a selfless act of kindness in a greasy spoon diner on a rainy night. They were two broken souls who had found their missing pieces in each other, creating a whole more beautiful and stronger than they could have ever imagined. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the quiet, profound reality of a shared life, built on a foundation of unwavering love. This story, at its heart, is a testament to the seismic power of a single, selfless act. It serves as a profound reminder that the kindness we extend to others, especially when we expect nothing in return, can create ripples that transform not only their world, but our own. Alara, in her moment of deepest hardship, chose compassion over self-preservation. She saw a human being in need and acted, without calculation or thought of reward. In doing so, she didn't just save a man's life, she reawakened his soul. Alistair, trapped in the hollow, gilded cage of his grief, was saved not by his immense wealth, but by the pure, unsolicited goodness of a stranger. Her act became the catalyst for his own healing, giving him a renewed purpose and showing him that even after the most shattering loss, the heart can learn to feel again. Their journey together illustrates a universal truth, that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the connections we forge and the love we share. It is a story about how seeing the humanity in others is the most valuable gift we can ever give. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the power of kindness, please let it inspire you. In a world that can often feel cold and transactional, every small act of compassion is a rebellion of the heart, a beacon of hope that proves goodness will always find a way to shine through the darkness. Look for the moments where you can be the light for someone else, for you never know whose life you might be saving, or whose soul you might be healing. For more soul-stirring tales of love, redemption, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit, be sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. We are dedicated to bringing you the most inspiring and heartwarming stories that remind us of the beauty in the world and the goodness in each other. We'll see you in the next one.